Well, welcome again. I am Pastor Chris Lockie, and so good to be with you. As Dave said, he's a very persuasive guy. As I had said how I did this study on the flood at my church, and he's like, "Oh, that sounds really interesting. Would you like to come and do it for our group?" I was supposed to do it last year, and sure enough, I had that heart attack. And decided, you know what, better wait for a while as I was doing the therapy. But glad that I'm here. Let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we thank you for this night and that we can gather in this place to share in this study of your word and just reflecting about how your amazing world gives testament to the facts of what we see in your word, of how you cause the great deep to burst forth, and you open the windows of the heavens to bring forth the flood waters, and how we see the evidence of that all over the world. And I pray your blessing upon this talk, and that, Lord, you will bless this time that we have together, that these folks will grow in their knowledge, not of only of your word, but also of your world through this gathering tonight. So we pray this in your name, dear Jesus. Amen. All right. So, why are we here? Why this study? So this is my crew. That is my wife and my 4 kids. That was a couple years ago in 2021. We did a trip out east, and we stopped at the Ark Encounter. Now, I imagine a good share of you have probably been there. How many of you have been to the Ark Encounter? Wonderful. Yeah, just amazing, isn't it? It just, to be, in fact, met Bill that worked on it, some of the electrical stuff, which is amazing. Just the scale of it. So that's my wife, Corinne, my son, Levi is the oldest, and then Anna, and then Katie, and Ben, and it's amazing in just a couple years how much they've already changed from that picture. So I left from the Ark Encounter, and naturally I was very inspired by this, and got some of their resources. It was funny how I went around and I was taking I'm sure you probably did this too. I was taking pictures of all the signs all the way along, and then I get to the end and realize there's a book with all of them in it, right, that I could just buy. And so was very grateful for that. So I've used that for this resource as well as some other things. So anyway, so I then did a study through Genesis 6 through 9, and so I'm taking a bunch of slides from that and then a bunch that I added on to. Okay, so what can I bring to the study and what can't I, just in complete honesty, okay? Well, I don't claim to be a Hebrew scholar by any means, but I have studied it, know it from seminary and from my just work in the scriptures, obviously. And so we'll be bringing that to you tonight, so understanding the Hebrew words that are used when it talks about the great deep burst forth and how the windows of heaven were opened up when it comes to the flood, okay? What also can I bring? I can bring what I've started regarding the evidence, right, that I've studied as far as a worldwide flood that supports the biblical account. What I can't bring, necessarily, is a deep knowledge of some of the science behind it. Some of you probably will have even greater knowledge going to these talks as much as you have and hearing all the speakers that you have. So if I misrepresent anything, I'm just going to give a caveat right now. Please feel free to correct me, okay? But I do my study, and so to the best of my knowledge, I'll try to bring you the facts of all this. Okay, so let's get into it. So I'm going to focus particularly on these 2 verses of Genesis 7. Now this is in the English Standard Version of the translation, okay? The English Standard Version. So, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So obviously, that's in English. So, what could this be referring to? Okay. So the Hebrew word for, as translated fountains there in the ESV, can also be translated springs. And I gave you a few examples. So I've got a Bible program that I use called BibleWorks where I can actually highlight a particular Hebrew word, and it will show me all the places that it appears in the Old Testament. Okay? So these are just a few examples of when it talks about the fountains or the springs burst forth. So one of them is in Leviticus 11:36. It says, "Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern holding water shall be clean. Whoever touches a carcass in them shall be unclean." So it's talking about if an unclean animal falls into a body of water or a cistern, right, that made a dead animal, that now made that water unclean. Okay? But that particular Hebrew word is used in that particular verse where it's translated there, a spring, probably more referring to like just that a body of water of some sort. Okay? Joshua 18:15. "And the southern side begins the outskirts of Kiriath Jearim, and the boundary goes from there to Ephron, to the springs of the waters of Nephtoah." Okay? So there, spring would be a source of water from underground that leads to probably like a stream, a river or pond. Here's a couple other times where it occurs in 2 Kings 3:19. "And you shall attack every fortified city and every choice city, and shall fell every good tree, and stop up all springs of water, and ruin every good piece of land with stones." Now this is Elisha's instructions for Israel to defeat Moab, right? So they're supposed to stop up the springs of water. So from what we've hopefully seen so far, okay, it's talking about bodies of water, sources of water, obviously. 2 Chronicles 32:4 is another example. "A great many people were gathered, and they stopped all the springs in the brook that flowed through the land, saying, 'Why should the kings of Israel come and find much water?'" These are the instructions of King Hezekiah as Assyria attacked. Okay. Also a couple examples from the Psalms. So Psalm 74:15, "You split open springs and brooks. You dried up ever-flowing streams." Psalm 104, "You make streams gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills." Okay. So it obviously seems to be referring to source of water, which would lead to bodies or streams of water. Now, you guys are maybe familiar with this as far as where the source of the Mississippi begins. Okay? Have you ever been to Lake Itasca? Some of you? Okay, good. It's interesting. This is really the start right here of the Mississippi River out of that lake. Just a small little stream, right? Now, really the source of it, though, are even smaller tributaries that kind of run into this lake, okay? Now, the reason why I show this to you is to say this is the idea behind these springs of water. The source of water is the Hebrew word means, okay? So as I said there, the actual source of Mississippi are these tributaries that feed into it. Now, I found this on the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency website. It says groundwater springs are present throughout much of the river channel throughout this watershed. These springs are especially common above Lake Bemidji, where groundwater contributes approximately 2/3 of the Mississippi River's flow in this section, right? These groundwater springs from underneath that feed these bodies of water that feed the river, all right? Another example. I went here a few years ago. My folks, so I'm originally from Iowa, small town in Iowa. So my folks still live in northeast Iowa. And we met one time at Governor Dodge State Park. I'm sure, how many of you have been there? Okay, just a really gorgeous state park to be able to hike around in, right? And what's really incredible is, these streams that begin and how so many of course, they begin out of the rock. So, this is kind of the understanding of, so these fountains, these springs, burst forth of the great deep. Now, what does the great deep refer to? Okay, So that Hebrew word that's found there is first found in Genesis 1:2, where it says, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, is how it's translated into English, right? Now, Moses uses this word to describe where the Egyptian army was swept down into in the Red Sea. It's talking about being swept down into the deep. Job describes the deep of the sea in Job 38:16. Psalm 33:7 talks about the deep seems to be associated with the seas, and there's other verses that I could give you from the Psalms. Okay. And this is a quote from one of the commentaries that I use on Genesis. It says, deep or deep waters occurs 36 times in the Old Testament. Its basic meaning, deep water, is found in many passages. Deep water can threaten life in that a man may drown in it. There's the reference to the Red Sea in Exodus 15. But it can also assure the continuance of life in the dry climate in the Near East. In a small number of passages, including this one, is identified with the primeval ocean that is supposed to surround and underlie the earth. So does this underlying ocean still exist today? Well, yes, okay, in a sense. Do you know, and I'm sure many of you do, 30% of the world's fresh water is found underground in deep reservoirs or aquifers. This was something that I found kind of interesting because I'm going to show you a graphic of this in a little bit as far as these deep water aquifers that are all over the world, okay? So this is from actually the Central Intelligence Agency website. I happen to find this of all places, where it says this entry lists the major mega aquifer systems that underlie a country, keeping in mind that many of these mega aquifers are so large that they extend under multiple countries. More than 30% of the fresh water is held in the underground aquifers. There's great variation in the size of such aquifers, but a limited number of very large aquifer systems contain a majority of the world's groundwater. So here's a picture of this 30% of the world underneath. Now, of course, we know at the time of the flood, okay, and I'll get to this later, right? Our understanding, we believe, is that it was probably like, you know, the Pangea that you've learned about, right, where all the land mass was together and then broke up as part of the flood, and we'll talk about that later. But one of the things that I was reading is that, you know, if you remember in Genesis 1, God created the waters, and then, of course, he separated them, right? So was there an equal amount of water above and equal water below? And that when he then created the land on the third day, you know, was all this water trapped underneath the land that he created? Well, probably, certainly, right? So anyway, so statistics from the United Nations indicate the total volume of fresh water on the earth is around 35 million cubic kilometers. 30% is stored underground, potentially available for human consumption, okay? Now, why does this matter? We'll get to that in a little bit here, okay? From that same website, it says there are 37 great aquifer systems of the world. These 37 largest aquifers jointly cover almost 35 million square kilometers, equivalent to just under a quarter of the entire land surface. So that is how much water there is underneath, right? And of course, we know probably those are just some of the major aquifers. Now, this is what this computer does with my Hebrew. It makes it all wonky. My old Bible program that I have is still on the old CDs that this laptop cannot download. But anyway, so imagine those underwater then reserves bursting forth. Now, all of that stuff at the top would be the Hebrew word that's used. Now, what's interesting is this word bursting forth, how it's used in the Old Testament. So it can mean to split, as in wood, like Genesis 22:3. Now, any Bible scholars amongst us? What's Genesis 22:3? What's the context? Abraham and Isaac, right? Where he has them cut the wood, right, that he carries for his sacrifice. Okay? So splitting, cutting the wood. It's the same word used to describe God's splitting or parting of the Red Sea in Exodus 14:16, or splitting the ground in Numbers 16:31. This ground that swallowed up Korah and the people who joined him in his rebellion against Moses and Aaron. So it seems to describe a splitting, right? A rupturing of the great deep, causing the springs or the fountains to burst forth, right? Probably in the form of earthquakes and volcanoes. Now, this is from the Ark Encounter, which is one of the pictures that they have, right, of how this would work, okay? And so in this graphic, a new world there, these are the words that's found there. In approximately 1 year, the wicked pre-flood world consisting of a supercontinent is destroyed. A new world with 7 continents rise from the waters. They are covered with layers of fossil-filled sediment deposited by water, testifying of the biblical account of Genesis. Okay, that's what we know, right, and believe. So then here's another, now this is one of the signs from the creation, from the Ark Encounter, right, of these fissures that open up and create these fountains of water that go into the atmosphere, this bursting forth of the great deep. Now that particular sign reads, as fissures widen in the Earth's crust, magma comes into contact with seawater, creating massive jet streams. These stream jets shoot through the ocean and into the upper atmosphere, generating intensely heavy global rainfall for 40 days and 40 nights. I think it's safe to say, of course, this definitely contributed, right? Because, and just thinking about it on a small scale, my family a couple years ago, it was, we'd planned this in late 2019 and early 2020 that we were going to do a trip out west to Yellowstone. Well, what happened in 2020 in March? Okay, so we debated, do we go or do we not with everything going on? Well, we decided to leap of faith, right, and follow the Lord's plan, and we decided we're going to go. We're going to go even though it's 2020. Actually, it worked out really well because gas prices were really low at that time. I remember getting gas for $1.79 in Wyoming. It was like perfect timing, right, to still go. Anyway, so we went all the way out to Yellowstone National Park. Now, part of the reason why we went out there, too, is because my oldest 2 were born in South Dakota, Rapid City, South Dakota. I served a church there right out of seminary. And so we wanted to see where they wanted to see where they were born and do a trip out there. So we went out to Yellowstone. Now, how many of you have been to Yellowstone? Okay, so a good share of you, obviously. Okay, it's incredible, isn't it, to watch Old Faithful and the amount of water that comes out of there. Actually, I almost thought, in a way, this particular one, the Grand Geyser, we just happened to hit it just right. It's not as consistent as Old Faithful, but it's almost more impressive as far as the water that comes up from it. And we just happened to be coming upon it when it was erupting at the time. So there's a picture that I took when I was there. Now, why am I showing you these pictures? Obviously, think about, okay, all that water underneath. Now, all of a sudden, this ripping part, this splitting, right, this rupturing of the great deep and the fountains and springs, and how much water would erupt out of there. Now, we know how volcanoes can affect the weather. Now, I'm sure some of you've had talks on volcanoes. Sounds like you've got a speaker who's very good as far as that kind of thing. Once again, I don't know the deep science of some of this stuff. Maybe some of you know it better than I do. But it really was fascinating to read some of this stuff. So this is from the United States Geological Survey, okay? And this will probably be review, right, for some of you. You know, how volcanoes can impact climate change. During major explosive eruptions, huge amounts of volcanic gas, aerosol droplets, and ash are injected into the atmosphere, right? Injected ash falls rapidly from the stratosphere and most of it's removed in several days to a week, and has little impact on climate change. But volcanic gases like sulfur dioxide can cause global cooling, while volcanic carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, has the potential to promote global warming. Okay? So these are examples. It's kind of talking about, some of these impacts that it has, and I won't read all of that for you. But I did find this interesting. It says, several eruptions during the past century have caused a decline in the average temperature at the Earth's surface of up to 0.5 degree Fahrenheit scale for periods of 1 to 3 years. The climatic eruption of Mount Pinatubo, if I'm saying that right, on June 15, 1991, was one of the largest eruptions of the 20th century. It ejected a 20 million ton metric scale sulfur dioxide cloud into the atmosphere at an altitude of more than 20 miles. The Pinatubo cloud was the largest sulfur dioxide cloud ever observed in the stratosphere since the beginning of such observations by satellites in 1978. It caused what is believed to be the largest aerosol disturbance of the stratosphere in the 20th century, though probably smaller than disturbances from eruptions of Krakatoa, okay? Krakatoa. Thank you. Okay. I'm a pastor, but I'm not necessarily a linguist in this way. So in 1883, and Tambora, did I get that one right? Okay, good. In 1815, consequently, it was a standout in its climate impact and cooled the Earth's surface for 3 years following the eruption by as much as 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit at the height of the impact. Okay. Now, this is all from this United States Geological Survey. It says the large 1783 through 1784 Lockie, did I say that right? Maybe. Fissure eruption in Iceland released a staggering amount more sulfur dioxide than Pinatubo. Although the two eruptions were significantly different in length and style, the added atmospheric CO2 caused regional cooling of Europe and North America by similar amounts for similar periods of time. So the reason why I'm showing you this, and once again, you've probably had talks on this before, that if the bursting force of this great deep of all the fountains and springs was in the form, obviously, of volcanoes, this breaking apart of or earthquake and blasting all of this stuff out up into the atmosphere, how that would affect the climate all over the world, right? Here's a picture from one of the websites as far as how this would all work. And so that's why I said, imagine this on a worldwide scale. And this is where I got this from christiananswers.net that speculates on how this works. So the fountains of the great deep are probably oceanic or possibly subterranean source of water. In the context of flood account, it could mean both. If the fountains of the great deep were the major source of the waters, then they must have been a huge source of water. Some have suggested that when God made the dry land appear from under the waters on the third day of creation, some of the water that covered the earth became trapped underneath and within the dry land. Genesis 7:11 says that on the day the flood began, there was a breaking up, obviously, of the fountains, which implies the release of the water, possibly through large fissures in the ground or in the sea floor. The waters that had been held back burst forth with catastrophic consequences. There are many volcanic rocks interspersed between the fossil layers and the rock record, layers that are obviously deposited during Noah's flood. So it is quite plausible that these fountains of the great deep involved a series of volcanic eruptions with prodigious amounts of water bursting up through the ground. It's interesting that up to 70% or more of what comes out of volcanoes today is water, often in the form of steam. And this is an old resource that I have. Actually copyrights to 1951, but it's quite interesting because it doesn't have, these later years of influence, and so the The things that he's citing were things that happened in the 1700s, 1800s, and so on. But he talks in this book about that active volcanoes give off vapor in quantities almost beyond comprehension, a fact established by observation. Steam equivalent to 460 million gallons of water has been observed to issue from one of the subsidiary cones of Mount Etna within 100 days, which would mean 46 gallons of water a day, and only from one secondary cone of one volcano. So imagine this, that's just one, right? All around the world, this great deep bursting forth with all of this water and steam, and how that would affect the global, what happens globally, and that we know scientifically that would lead to, right, or contribute to the large amounts of rain that comes on the 40 days, right, and 40 nights. Okay. Now, this is from the Answers in Genesis website, okay, thinking about just simply the phenomenon of Yellowstone, okay. Now, you probably know much of this, but much of Yellowstone is positioned on the enormous craters of several volcanoes, one of them the largest in North America. Every so often, news headlines predict an eruption, warning that the ginormous mass of ash and lava would spell certain disaster for North America. I don't know if any of you guys have seen some of these programs, right? Evidently one's a documentary, Yellowstone Supervolcano, America Doomsday. Claims Yellowstone is a disaster waiting to happen with the power to change the face of the earth. It will be a global catastrophe and bring the world to a standstill. Well, why is that? Why are there so many geysers in the Yellowstone area? It's because much of the area centered on Yellowstone Lake is the cauldron-like crater, referred to as the caldera of a humongous volcano. And that's what I found interesting, having never gone there, right, in person until my family just went out there in 2020, is how many places, everywhere, right? There's steam coming up everywhere. I mean, it's not just in the Old Faithful area. I mean, you'll find it along, Lake Yellowstone, everywhere you go, right? And maybe you guys know this, but it was really quite fascinating to me. So known as the Yellowstone Caldera, the crater measures a staggering 43 by 28 miles. As the largest volcano on the North American continent with a history of huge explosive eruptions, no wonder the Yellowstone Caldera is called a supervolcano, right? But it did erupt several times in the past, they believe, with devastating consequences. Some of the thick ash deposits have been found as far away as Texas. Had anyone been living in North America back then, they would have faced dire consequences. Now, this is from the Answers in Genesis, a little article on this. And they had a diagram, which I did not know this, and maybe you do, right? That this is studying the rock, I guess, of western United States, that they think the eruption of Yellowstone, right, and the ash plume that it created, that there were two different potential eruptions that happened, but that the rock that settled, right, or the ash that settled and then hardened and so on, look how big of a territory that covers, right? All the way down to southern Texas, up to Montana, clear out to California, and so on. So that's just one. So if that's just one of the potential bursting forth of the great deep, imagine what that would cause worldwide, right? So he talks then in Answers website, there seems to be evidence for at least two major eruptions from the Yellowstone supervolcano at some time in history. Now, is there evidence of volcanic eruptions happening in the past on a large scale? The answer is yes. Now, this is what's fascinating. Now, I'm sure some of you guys, you're doing searches on your phones, right, or things like that. It knows everything about you anymore. Seems like, as far as like what you like and what you don't. So I just happened to be sitting and looking at my phone one day, and this article comes up from USA Today from November 28th of just this past year. Okay? And this is just an excerpt from it. Reigniting the debate, a certain study posited that volcanic eruptions may have already thrown the ecosystem into chaos and threatened the existence of non-bird dinosaurs before the asteroid crashing into Earth delivered the final blow. Okay? The international team of researchers are the latest experts who claim that the world the dinosaurs roamed was one teeming with critical levels of sulfur that set the stage for their extinction. Such instability would have triggered a global drop in temperatures around the world, creating conditions inhospitable to life, according to the research. Okay? And this is a team of researchers through McGill University. So, I mean, these are not creation scientists. Okay? So he goes into this. So this is this article is found. It was published in October in Science Advances magazine. It says, our research demonstrates that climatic conditions were almost certainly unstable, with repeated volcanic winters that could have lasted decades prior to the extinction of the dinosaurs. Now, this is a study co-authored by this Don Baker, a geologist at McGill University, said in a statement, our work helps explain the significant extinction event that led to the rise of mammals and the evolution of the species. Now, of course, I wouldn't agree with those last statements, but here's what they actually studied, okay? So what they studied, and maybe you guys have had different studies about this in the past, they studied these rock samples from the Deakin traps. Does anybody know this term better than I do? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Deccan?
No, Deccan. Accent on the first syllable.
Deccan. Okay. So it's this volcanic rock. They were formed by a large amount of volcanic activity in previous times. Science is definitely behind this, but the conclusions are interesting. So this is from this study. It says, warming and cooling trends preceding the KPB are interpreted as a signal that degassing from Deccan, did I say it right? Deccan, maybe, traps volcanism was already forcing the global end Cretaceous climate, possibly enhanced by orbitally driven ice. I won't bury you with all that. But essentially what he's saying is that there was this volcanic activity that there seems to be evidence for that predates, now of course in their dating of the rock and so on, the big asteroid that they claimed that hit in Mexico, okay, which is, somebody know how to pronounce that? I should have studied all these beforehand. The Chicxulub? Am I saying that right? Okay. Impact that wreaked further havoc on previously volcanically perturbed global ecosystems. Some have argued that the Deccan volcanism alone was sufficient to induce a mass extinction, and that that crater impact only served to exacerbate its consequences on the ecosystems. Conversely, others suggest the greenhouse forcing of these traps, degassing played a mitigating role on the impact-derived global winter. Okay, so in other words, this is one of the things it says in here. The steady drop in temperature during the latest Cretaceous coincides with the emplacement of the, I won't even pretend to do that, of these lavas, the ones showing the highest sulfur concentrations. So towards the end it says, however, as modeled before, sulfur emissions from these Deccan traps could have marked consequences on the global climate, up to 10 kilometers Celsius temperature drop, if discharged through sustained prolonged activity, even accounting for short hiatuses between individual eruptions. So the conclusion of this is such voluminous recurring eruptive pulses could have caused repeated global cold spells with temperature drops of up to 10 Celsius, interspersed with rapid recovery episodes. He says the final blow on the biota, now I'm just reading the underlined part here, was likely given by that crater in Mexico impact, but our data set indicates the volcanic-driven climate disturbance was already underway before the KPB, possibly driving a press pulse extinction model, okay? So, in other words, what their conclusion is they're saying, you know, some of the scientific community obviously says, well, how did the dinosaurs become extinct? Well, there was the great, you know, asteroid that hit. But what they're arguing is from their study of the volcanic rock that predates that. And so it might have been this mass volcanic activity in various places of the world that actually led to these global winters and therefore potentially the extinction, right, of the dinosaurs, which is what one of the theories, of course, that creationists will hold to, you know, that we know the dinosaurs were animals that God created, and so if he created and they were still around at the time of the flood, which we have every reason to believe that they were on the ark, right? So they got off the ark, so then what happened to them afterwards? Well, if now the climate change, if the world climate changed because of all of this activity, you know, that might have led to then they could not survive the new global climate, right? Which is essentially what it's kind of getting at, okay? So, as I said, there's a lot of scientific jargon saying a large amount of volcanic activity in previous time would have caused a significant cooling event on the Earth and led to an extinction of animals. Of course, this theory the Ark Encounter subscribes to. Now, once again, how this would affect the middle of the Earth, it might not still be bearable, not completely freezing, but at the extremes, it might have been very difficult, right, for these animals to live. We know the animals got off the ark at Mount Ararat, which of course is modern-day Turkey. And it was after a year and 11 days in the ark, is what, you know, calculations are. So, or what the Bible tells us. So the influence of all that volcanic activity has subsided enough by that time for things to be inhabitable again, at least in part of the earth, obviously. Okay. So, interestingly, this does support other studies theorizing the same thing, like an answer to Jez that talks about volcanic demise hypotheses, such as what was put forth kind of in the previous article. In this article in 2012, volcanoes, not meteorite, killed dinosaurs, scientist argues. Okay. Also, there was a previous study of these Deccan traps published in Science magazine in October 2015. It speculates that volcanic activity predates the asteroid hitting of the Earth and must have led to the extinction. Now this is, you know, and he goes into more of this as far as how this all would work in this article, okay, of these Deccan traps in western India. Okay. I'm not going to read all of that for you, but it's saying the same kind of thing. So like in the last part of it, it says, at the plate boundaries, the magma rapidly rising into the fissures would push the plates apart so that their separation accelerated to meters, tens of feet per second. The net result would have been violent volcanic eruptive events on a massive global scale. Right? Is one of the conclusions from this, okay? So he says at the start and early stage of the flood, as the pre-flood seafloor spread, it would have subducted into the mantle. At the same time this was occurring, the reluctant tensional stress tore apart the pre-flood supercontinent. As the tectonic plates spread, mantle plumes produced by return convective flow would have risen through fissures in the crust, causing increased lava flows. Right? Continued barrages by meteors during the flood would have only exacerbated this process. Sometime after the 150th day of the flood, once again, that meteor impact and these Deccan eruptions are likely to occur. This actually fits the interpretation of the analytical data in Science paper that the deep crustal magma chambers suddenly enlarged right about the time of the impact. All right. So, long way of saying, obviously the geology all over the world favors this large amount of volcanic activity at one time in its past, right? Now, one could ask at this point, yeah, but what about Noah and his family leaving in the ark through this? Well, as I said, could be he's allowing these bursting forth of the great deep in other places, obviously, other than where they're at, as far as being able to survive it as far as the ark. Okay. Now, this is where I was getting to. The other part of it is in Genesis 7:11, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Okay. Now, this word for window, in some cases, could be almost like translated like chimney, okay, sort of thing. Hosea 13:3 is an example. Therefore they shall be like the morning mist, or like the dew that goes early away, like the chaff that swirls from the threshing floor, and like smoke from a window. Okay, and there's other references to the windows of heaven also in Malachi 3:10, Isaiah 24:18. Like in the middle part there, if I will not open the kingdom windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. Isaiah 24:18, the second part, for the windows of heaven are open, the foundation of the earth tremble. Right? So what does the heavens mean? Well, in Genesis 1:6-8, God said, let there be expanse in the midst of the waters, and made the expanse separate the waters that were above from the expanse from the waters that were above and made the expanse and separated the waters that were above the expanse from the waters that were above. Maybe I typed that in wrong, but so. And God called the expanse heaven. Okay. Therefore, the windows of the heavens would be the windows of this expanse, right? As far as the Hebrew word that's used there. Okay. So according to this commentator Wenham, put another way, the firmament or expanse occupies the space between the earth's surface and the clouds. Quite how the Old Testament conceives the nature of the firmament is less clear. So he goes on, once again, this is what this computer does with my Hebrew there. But the Hebrew word is derived etymologically from that Hebrew word to stamp or spread. In Exodus 39:3, it means to spread by hammering. In Job 37:18, speaks of the skies being spread out hard as a molten mirror. And it says the noun is rare outside Genesis 1. Ezekiel 1:22 and Daniel 12:3 describes the firmament as shining. Such comments may suggest the firmament was viewed as a glass dome over the earth, and since the most vivid descriptions occur in poetic text, the language may be figurative. Okay? So in other words, the Lord opened up this windows of this expanse called heaven, described almost like this canopy over the earth. And so, I mean, we've all been a part of this or seen this, right? You get a really hard 2 to 4 inch rain or something like that, and how much water can be moved in such a short amount of time from just a small few hour deluge, right? Even so, so you've got the two things at play, the bursting force of the great deep, and then the windows of the heavens opened up, and there's where all the water is needed to cover the earth, to 15 cubits above, right, the highest peak, right, which would be, a cubit, and I'm sure you saw this at the Ark Encounter, right? They typically was like from your elbow to your fingertip, typically about a foot and a half, although there was the royal cubit they talk about at the Ark Encounter too, which is a little bit longer. So roughly about that amount, right, above. Okay, so what other evidence do we see in the world of this bursting forth and what it might have caused, right? Well, around the world there's evidence of what geologists call rubble drift and osphorous fissures, I should say. Okay. Once again, in this book on the flood, talks about that there was already evidence pointing to the worldwide flood that had been uncovered. He talks about rubble drift is meant a certain type of deposit or sediment consisting of massive angular and rolled material, tumultuously deposited in local pockets and catchment areas, generally full of shattered bones. And then these osseous fissures are meant great fissures or rents in the earth, which are formed by some violent contortion of the surface of the earth. Okay, so here's a picture. You guys probably seen this kind of thing, right? Here's an example of one that opened up in Arizona. That was taken in 2017. So we know these fissures created by earthquakes can be massive. Once again, in this flood book, it says, in the year 1783, a great earthquake occurred at Calabria, which caused fissures to be opened 500 feet wide and 1,000 feet long, right? And then he goes on to give many more examples, right, of this around the world. And so, now this is really small kind of print. You're not going to be able to read all of this, but I'll kind of read some for you. I'm sorry if this gets a little bit boring. But the evidence of such fissures have been found in many places of the earth, some of them measuring from 140 to 300 feet in depth. They were filled with debris which drifted into them soon after they opened. This probably explains why they did not close again. Such fissures have been found in England, France, southern Spain, Germany, Russia, and elsewhere. The interesting feature of these fissures is the debris found in them, for they are filled with the remains of animals, among those of the elephant, rhinoceros, hippopotamus, the reindeer, horse, hog, ox. Bones found in them cannot be of animals which fell in alive or were buried there, for no skeleton is complete. They cannot have been brought there by streams, for those who have examined them found no signs on them of having been rolled. Neither could the bones have been exposed to the weather for a long time, for none of them show marks of weathering. That water had something to do with depositing them is indicated by the very general cementing together deposits by calcite. Okay, so he gives an example, okay, of this large deposit of bones in a cavity of calcareous beds of the steppes of Russia was discovered in 1847 near Odessa. In this cavity were found 4,500 bones of bears, derived from at least 100 individual animals. With these were found remains of species of the cat family, hyenas, horses, boars, mammoth, rhinoceros, and deer, together with remains of numerous insectivores and rodents such as hares, otters, martens, as well as wolves and foxes. And he gives examples of these kind of deposits in France, Greece, Germany, England, Italy, all over the place, okay? In fact, he cites one such deposit found in the northwest corner of Nebraska. He says this bone bed was accidentally discovered in 1876, contains the bones of rhinoceros, camels, giant wild boars, and other animals buried together in a confused mass as only water would deposit them. It's estimated the bones of about 9,000 complete animals are buried on this one hill. So he says, it has been observed by such a competent geologist as Prestwich that these phosphorus fissures are usually found upon isolated hills of considerable height, places on which we might expect animals to gather in seeking safety from approaching flood. Seeing in terror and driven by the common danger, the carnivorous and herbivorous alike sought refuge on the same elevation, only to meet even here a common watery grave, right? Which, why would a bunch of, rodents and things like that be buried in the exact same place with a whole bunch of predators? Of course, these kinds of sites exist in lots of places, like in South Dakota. This is the Mammoth site in Hot Springs, South Dakota. It really was interesting there. It was discovered when a crane operator in 1974 struck something that shone white in the sun. He discovered it was this mass grave of all these mammoths. And you can go there and see, them uncovering them and so on. Now, this is another thing. So 2 summers ago, my family did a little trip to eastern Iowa, Okay, now of course I said my folks live in northeast Iowa. And so we visited Spook Cave. Anybody ever been to Spook Cave in Iowa? Dave, have you been there? Really? Okay. So it's near McGregor, which is along the Mississippi River there. Okay. And it is this kind of unknown little treasure there in northeast Iowa. Anyway, on the tour guide was pointing out these marine fossils in the rocks above in the cave. And it says it was from the Iowa Ocean. Well, I was curious about this, right? So I asked him about it. He didn't really know. He said somebody else had told him. He's just the tour guide. He doesn't know anything, right? He just. So anyway, so then I started kind of researching this. So this is from the University of Iowa, College of Hydroscience and Engineering website. They put together this mobile museum talking about the sea, right, that existed over Iowa. Okay. Now, I know it's small print, but it says the Iowa Geologic Survey research specialist, Paul Liu, if I'm saying that right, team discovered that, of course, take this for the source, the 465 million years ago, a meteorite struck the earth in the area that is now Decorah, Iowa, which I grew up 45 minutes west of Decorah, Iowa, okay? In the resulting crater, the researchers found an astonishing collection of exceptionally well-preserved fossils. The site represents one of only a few such, I'm not even going to try that. What's it? Lagerstätten, okay. Scientists searched for a fossil deposit this magnitude from the middle Vision period, okay. Anyway, see, I did the caveat right at the beginning, okay. I'm limited with some of this stuff, obviously, but I can research it. But one of the things that I found interesting was that last paragraph. One of the most dramatic finds was the sea scorpion, the earliest and largest such animal of that period, with a long head shield, a narrow curving body, and huge, scary claw-like limbs that could easily trap the creature's unfortunate prey. The sea scorpion's modern relatives include spiders, lobsters, and ticks. Imagine a 6-foot tick. Now this is what this professor's saying. He's not a creation scientist, okay? But this is a picture of this thing. So that evidently was in Iowa, in the Iowa Ocean. Okay? Now, this is what it says here. Now, this is for one, I have to ask, how did that get in Iowa? Okay? Where did all that salt water come from? Right? He talked about that in the article. Okay? So he goes on, he says, Iowa's been underwater. Now this is from the Iowa PBS website. Iowa's been underwater in one form or another for much of its history, they say. Ancient seas covered Iowa while it was located near the equator. For millions of years, the continental plate on which Iowa sits has slowly wandered around the globe. At one time, the plate split apart, creating a rift. Then it moved back together. Several other times it crashed into other plates. These crashes caused parts of the land to get pushed up out of the water. These earthquaking events often formed mountains. The oldest mountain remnants of Iowa are found in Sioux Quartzsite in the northwest corner of the state. Okay, maybe if you've ever been there. Okay, I wouldn't exactly call them mountains, but they are an elevated part of Iowa, no doubt. Okay, so when the land was above water, waves and rain were to wear away the rocks. When plates crashed together again, the land often got pushed back down. So in other words, it goes into all of this, but it certainly sounds like the remnants of an ancient flood, right? And the great deep bursting forth moving plates to me. In fact, if you visit Wisconsin Dells and do the wagon ride tour, any of you ever done this tour, the Lost Canyon tours? Okay. So they will tell you the rock formations there were formed from water cutting down into the rock from an ancient sea, but they don't explain, of course, how the sea got there or where it went. But this is from a sign at Wisconsin Dells, okay? The word Dells was derived from the French word dalles, once again, I apologize if I'm saying this wrong, meaning flat layered or slab rock. These layers of rock were formed during the Cambrian period 500 years ago when the North American continent was completely covered by an ocean, the Cambrian Sea. Layer upon layer of sand and silts formed on the bottom of this ocean. As the water receded, the layers of minerals solidified into sandstone. Beginning of the Ice Age, approximately 1 million years ago, okay? So notice the difference in age they would claim, right? 499 million years between when the sea existed to the Ice Age. A series of glacial movements transformed the landscape, tearing of hilltops, filling valleys, and leveling out the surface of the earth in northern and eastern parts of Wisconsin. Dells was located on the extreme eastern margin of the driftless area, which was untouched by the glaciers. However, thousands of years later, when the glaciers began to melt, the water formed enormous and powerful streams, which pushed ice, rock, and debris through the sandstone, forming the spectacular, rugged beauty of the river shorelines. Okay, so this is from what I just read for you. Is from the sign that's found in Wisconsin Dells. All right, so biblical creation argued the theory of Pangea, of course. Theory that the land of our earth was once all together can be explained by this breaking up, right? Due to the flood, they argued the land would have quickly moved apart from this breakup, leading to continental divides. And I think you guys are probably familiar with this. Now this is, and once again, this is probably a review for some of you. Now this is an excerpt from Wikipedia. Now don't get your sourcing from there necessarily, but I did find this interesting. Which I know is true, right, out in the world. It says, fossil evidence for Pangea includes the presence of similar and identical species on continents that are now great distance apart. For example, fossils of the Therapsid, Lystrosaurus, if I'm saying that right, have been found in South Africa, India, and Antarctica, alongside members of the Glossoteris flora, okay, whose distribution would have ranged from the polar circle to the equator if the continents had been in their present position. Formerly, the freshwater reptile Mesosaurus has been found in only localized regions of the coast of Brazil and West Africa, right? So in other words, what it's saying is the fossils of this particular dinosaur only seems to have been found in these two, on continents miles and miles and miles apart. But if they were once together, that would make sense, right? Now, how do we get from Pangea to the great distances between these continents now? We think under the right conditions, the Earth's crust can move rapidly as plates break apart and move away from each other, okay? You're probably familiar with Dr. Andrew Snelling, okay, from Answers in Genesis, right? He goes into this whole thing, right? And I won't bore you with all of it, but essentially saying under these right conditions that these plates could move away from each other very quickly. And this kind of gets into, he actually goes into the history. He goes into the history of plate tectonics. A creationist named Antonio Snyder in 1859 first proposed the idea of continental drift. However, it was the same year that Charles Darwin's Origin of Species came out, so it didn't get much publicity or thought. So then later a German meteorologist, Alfred Wegener, then proposed the theory to the scientific community, and they took notice. Okay? Wegener, okay? Thank you for the corrections. So this is what he's got, Snelling, right, on the Answers to Genesis website, right, that would point towards the existence of the continents all being together and then have broken apart, okay? Obviously, the jigsaw puzzle fit of the continents, right? The correlation of fossils and fossil-bearing strata across the ocean basins, like the example of the coal beds of North America and Europe. This is what I found interesting too, number 3, and you probably know this. The mirror image zebra stripe pattern of magnetic reversals in the volcanic rocks and seafloor parallel to the mid-ocean rift zones and the plates on either side of the zone, consistent with the moving part of the plates, right? And I'm sure you've probably had speakers that could explain this a lot better than I could, but that's kind of was fascinating reading about that. Then number 4, the location of most of the Earth's earthquakes, the boundaries between the plates, of course, consistent with earthquakes being caused by 2 plates moving relative to one another. The existence of the deep sea floor trenches invariably located where earthquake activity suggests an oceanic plate and plunging into the mantle beneath one another. Okay. And he goes on, the mountain belts and so on. Okay. So in other words, the evidence cannot be denied. However, how does that get to the rapid movement that would have to have happened for Pangaea to become, to the place that they're at now? Well, once again, you can read through this article if you want on Answers to Genesis. But there's this 3D super computer model processes of how this works. And essentially, he goes into how under the right conditions, it would create a situation in which these plates could move across away from each other at staggering speeds of feet per second. Okay. Once again, I'm not going to pretend to know things like he does, but if you're interested in that, and I'm sure you are, right, you could go and read more about that. All right, so we will stop here. This is my recap, okay? So we know God's word says there was a splitting up, a bursting forth of the great deep, causing these springs or fountains to come forth from it. We see evidence of it all over the world with earthquakes and volcanoes, breaking of land masses in previous times. We know this bursting forth, if it was in the form of earthquakes, volcanoes can greatly affect weather, causing large amounts of rainfall in the cooling regions. Of course, this is how we then explain the ice ages, creationists, as a result of these massive changes that would have dramatically cooled areas of the world, freezing the large amounts of water that cover the earth, and that's another talk. Anyway, I'm glad that you guys, you guys were going to be here anyway, whether I was going to be or not, but appreciate the time and the opportunity to present this to you tonight, and hopefully you found some of it interesting as you go forth, so appreciate it.